Have you ever had Kellogg's Corn Flakes? Of course you have, but did you know that the entire idea behind the creation of the first Kellogg's Corn Flakes was to stop people from masturbating? Yep, you heard that right. The creator of Kellogg's hoped that the products of his company would stop you from thinking about sex. This is Munchable, and today we'll be looking at the origin of Kellogg's and how it was created by a man who wanted the world to stop having sex. Now, I'm sure you think that last bit was to reel you in, but no, it wasn't. John Kellogg actually detested people having sex. In fact, his greatest passion was centered around stopping people from thinking so much about sex. But wait, who is John Kellogg and why is he even important to this story? Thanks for asking. I'll tell you who he is and why. John Kellogg was many things. He was a nutritionist, inventor, health activist, businessman, and medical doctor. John was also, and this is extremely important, a Seventh Day Adventist. Why is this important? Well, John's faith shaped most of his life. When John Kellogg graduated from medical school in 1975, he graduated with some pretty interesting ideas. He had become a very vigorous advocate of sexual abstinence, but this wasn't without reason. As a doctor, he'd noticed firsthand the damaging impact of sexually transmitted illnesses like syphilis, an illness that was incurable in his time. Another source of his animosity towards sex was his faith. As a Seventh-day Adventist, he took the gospel of purity seriously. He stood against the sin of fornication and was particularly vocal about his dislike for masturbation. But those weren't the only grouses he had with sex. You see, John Kellogg also believed that too much sex was terrible for human beings. He believed that too much sex was harmful to emotional, mental, and physical well-being. That's not all. John was also against sexual excesses in marriage and believed sex was necessary only for reproduction, and that was all. Anything besides regular sex, believed John, was an extreme and unnatural, and indulging in it would lead to a wide range of illnesses. He also believed that masturbation was the cause of a range of natural diseases, such as epilepsy and other infirmities. In fact, he was so vehemently against masturbation that he said that neither the plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor similar diseases have produced results so disastrous to humanity as the pernicious habit of masturbation. Wow, high praise for jacking off, wouldn't you say? Basically, John believed that masturbation was everything wrong with the world and was evil beyond measure. After a while, John became quite convinced that one way to guarantee sexual abstinence was to have as little sexual thought as possible. Because, as everyone knows, if you don't think of sex at all, it would be difficult for you to think of committing the sin of fornication or masturbation. Therefore, John dedicated a sizable part of his life to inventing drugs, foods, and treatments that would stop people from thinking so much about sex. His thinking was simple. If it was possible to increase libido through the use of aphrodisiacs, then it would be equally possible to decrease libido through the use of anaphrodisiacs. After a period of studying, he came to the conclusion that a plain and healthy meal only 2 times a day would be enough to reduce libido. He came to the conclusion that if one is experiencing sexual temptation, the best thing to do was to avoid stimulating foods and drinks. So if you feel that urge is reaching a peak, it's probably the sugar in the soda you drank earlier. That's right, John believed that anytime you get that strong need to indulge in the act, you should check yourself. It's probably a result of eating something peppery or tasty. If you don't want to feel that way, he contended, avoid everything sweet, peppery, or tasty. Of course, we know that's not true today, but John didn't, and after coming to this conclusion, he decided that his next goal would be to make plain and healthy food for eating. That way, he would be able to directly contribute to reducing a societal and health vice in his own way. Of course, this was a decent plan, but as you'll learn in a few minutes, fate and John's brother Will Keith Kellogg would have entirely different ideas for the legacy of John Kellogg. For years, John had experimented on creating the perfectly plain and healthy meal that would generate low libido. His requirements were simple. The meal had to be vegetarian, plain, and healthy. For the most part of his research, he had his eyes on creating the perfect wheat-based granola. One day in 1894, while working at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a health, spa, wellness resort for the rich and famous, John and his brother Will were in the process of cooking some wheat for a type of granola when they were distracted by some matter. By the time they returned from attending to the matter, the wheat had turned stale. They decided to force the tempered grain through the rollers regardless and were quite shocked when the grain didn't come out as long sheets of dough. Instead, each wheat berry was flattened and came out as a thin flake. And that was the birth of Corn Flakes, or at least a roughly accurate first version of it. Will pressured John to serve the food in flake form, and he did. Soon, the flaked wheat was being packaged to meet mail order requests from guests after they left the sanitarium. Simply put, people who had been at the sanitarium and had eaten the flakes wanted more of it, and they were driving demand up. So, before Corn Flakes even became a brand, there was already a growing market for it. The next year, John Kellogg applied for a patent and he was granted one, and that's how commercial production of Corn Flakes started. However, what we know today to be Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and indeed even the Kellogg's company, was still very far away. The flakes that the brothers packaged and sold was bland and plain, exactly how John Kellogg liked it. In fact, to him, this was the perfect breakfast cereal. It was plain, healthy, and entirely vegetarian. It also had the added benefit of being great for suppressing sexual thought. At least that's what John thought, but Will Kellogg had other plans. He knew that the Corn Flakes had potential and could be much better if sugar was added to it. He told his brother the plan, but John disagreed. He wasn't going to add sugar to his perfect food. Sugar was certainly one of those elements that inspired horny thoughts in the minds of men, opined John, and he wasn't going to contribute to the sexual immorality epidemic. Of course, Will, being a far more sensible person than his brother, believed this to be total nonsense, and he started making plans to create his own company. In any case, the Kellogg's were experiencing immense success with their Corn Flakes. In the first year of production, they had sold tens of thousands of the flakes. It wasn't marketed as Corn Flakes in the market. Instead, it went by the pretty plain and bland name, Granos. The brothers continued to experiment with corn, wheat, and rice, and in 1898, they released the first batch of Sanitas toasted corn flakes. In 1906, after years of success together, Will Kellogg believed that the time was right. It was the right time for him to split from his brother and to make Corn Flakes in the way he believed was right. That same year, he convinced his brother to relinquish his rights to the product, and he formed the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flakes Company. This marked the start of a decade-long feud between the brothers, and it was this company that would eventually become what we now know as the Kellogg Company. As you would expect, Will Kellogg's Corn Flakes were way more successful and commercially viable than the ones made by his brother. Why? They had sugar, of course, and they weren't just plain old Corn Flakes. Before long, Corn Flakes were taking over the entire country. Let's pause and ask ourselves an important question. Why was Corn Flakes this popular in the first place? It was fairly a new product, but yet it was selling so much that Kellogg's couldn't keep up. Why did people enjoy Corn Flakes so much? Well, the answer was simple. Americans needed breakfast food. In the 1850s, the question, what's for breakfast, had any number of answers. Pies, meat, beef, literally anything. Americans were having a swell time eating whatever they could afford, but as expected, that led to a national epidemic of indigestion, which they called dyspepsia. However, there was a problem. It usually took too long for these meals to be prepared, and America needed a quick breakfast fix. Something that would be light and easy to make in the morning. Corn Flakes was a splendid fit. It could be made easily, was light, and was nutritious. Suddenly the question, what's for breakfast, had a more sensible answer. Breakfast cereal, and the Corn Flakes by the Kellogg's was the first of these. Quickly, I've got a challenge for you. Let us know your favorite breakfast cereal. Is it Corn Flakes? If it's not, or if it is, tell us why in the comments section. Now, let's get back to the story. As soon as Will Kellogg branched out and began producing his own Corn Flakes with added flavors, other businessmen discovered that they could also produce their own Corn Flakes without infringing on Kellogg's patent. And that is exactly what they did. Within a few years, the Kellogg's had created an entire industry of breakfast cereal, and they were the top players. The Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flakes Company was renamed the Kellogg Toasted Corn Flake Company in 1909, and it was named the Kellogg Company in 1922. In 1943, John Kellogg died, but the company that had its surname on it was far from death. In fact, the company was only starting to reach a semblance of the heights it would later reach in the next few decades. The company continued to grow and expand, and by the 1950s, the Kellogg Company already had a near monopoly of the breakfast cereal industry. By the 1970s, the company began to expand, and it began to acquire other small businesses like Salata Foods, Fern International, Mrs. Smith's Pies, Eggo, and Pure Packed Foods. The company also introduced new products including Crispix, Raisin Squares, and Nutri-Grain biscuits, and reached out internationally with Just Right, aimed at Australians, and Genmai Flakes from Japan. During this time, the Kellogg Company remained the #1 cereal maker in the country, and its competitors were finding it really difficult to compete. In 2001, the company acquired the Keebler Company for $3.87 billion and went on to acquire Morningstar Farms and Kashi divisions or subsidiaries. In 2012, Kellogg's became the second biggest snack producer in the world after PepsiCo. This happened after they bought Pringles from Procter & Gamble for $2.7 billion. Today, the Kellogg Company produces almost 100 products and employs over 30,000 people. It has become a gigantic company, and it all started with one man and his dislike for masturbation. The story of Kellogg's shows that even the weirdest motives can bring about desirable consequences. Today, John Kellogg's belief that sugar and meat contributes to sexual urges has been extensively disproved, but his invention to solve the problem has not. In fact, it has birthed a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and tomorrow morning, or the morning after next, or one morning in the future, you will most likely have a taste of that solution. And you'll most likely love it. The idea for this video was sent in by a subscriber. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to know more about a particular food brand, send it to us. Who knows? Our next video may be of that food brand. This is Munchables. Hope you enjoyed the video. Munch on!